Overall, welcome to the Grain Farmers of Ontario GrainTALK webinar series focusing on soil fertility. I'm Laura Ferrier, an agronomist with Grain Farmers of Ontario, and thank you so much for joining us. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I'm going to quickly cover off some general housekeeping. This is the third and final webinar in the soil fertility series. This webinar is on how to take a recommendation and turn it into a fertilization plan. The first webinar in the series was focused on soil sampling, the how, the why, and the when, and the second on the interpretation of results, turning analysis into recommendations, plus credits for manure and cover crops and tools to use. Some learnings from the first webinar in the series was that as crop yields increased, crop nutrient removal also increases. And it is so important to recognize and monitor soil test data. Sampling correctly at the right depth, in the right areas, and at the right time while avoiding challenging conditions such as extremely dry or frozen ground is a great start to your soil fertility plan. The second webinar in the series focused on how to take that soil test and make it work for you. And as with anything, there are many variables to creating a fertilization plan, depending on your fertilization philosophy, whether it be sufficiency, build and maintain, or crop removal approaches, along with individual growers' needs. And when looking at nitrogen application is always by the sufficiency approach, and secondary nutrients such as sulfur, boron, magnesium, and others are also very important to consider. And as with anything, rotation, manure, and cover crop credits need to be considered, along with their availability throughout the rotation to make a fulsome plan. And finally, there are some really great tools that are available to help you create a field management plan. Both prior webinars can be viewed on the Grain Farmers of Ontario YouTube channel. And while each webinar stands on its own, the series is designed to tell a complete story, from soil sampling to building a fertilization plan, and finally in this webinar, implementing that plan. So we encourage you to watch them all if you haven't already. This presentation is of course being recorded and will be posted on the Grain Farmers Ontario YouTube channel for future reference. This webinar is also eligible for CCACUs and off-CAF KSEs, and QR codes to scan will be available at the end of the presentation. We of course welcome questions, but we'll aim to ask them all at the end once the presentations have been ran through. And at that point, you are welcome to either unmute and ask your questions, or you can ask the questions in the chat feature and that I can then read out loud at the end, or you're also welcome to direct message myself at any point, and I will happily share the questions with our guest speakers. Now, I'm pleased to have two speakers here with us today. Dale and Colin are here to share various insights from all of their experience in the soil fertility space. And between the two of them, there's a lot of knowledge here today. I'll take a moment to introduce them both and then let them share their insights on today's topics. So, Colin Elgie is the soil fertility specialist for field crops with OMAFA. Colin's focus is to improve the agronomic, economic, and environmental aspects of soil and crop nutrition while learning from farmers and researchers across Ontario. Colin has been with OMAFA since 2022, prior to which he worked as an agronomist at an ag retailer in southwestern Ontario for 13 years after graduating from the University of Guelph. Colin holds his CCA designation with a 4R nutrient management specialty. And our second speaker today is Dale Cowan. Dale is the Agronomy Strategy Manager and Senior Agronomist for Agris Co-op in southwestern Ontario. His responsibilities involve training and supporting customer-facing staff in utilizing the digital ag strategy of technology, agronomy, and knowledge transfer in key areas of 4R stewardship and effective product positioning. Preparing the company and employees to operate in a mobile, digital, connected environment is a key part of that strategy. Technology is readily available. However, training and supporting staff with the new technology and new processes is as important as the tools that we use, which Dale assists with. Dale also holds a CCA designation along with a 4R nutrient management specialty. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura. So yeah, I'll start us off today. Yeah, I guess first thing we're looking to really build, like Laura had mentioned, on basically right from that, taking that soil test to reading and translating that soil test and really putting that whole plan into action. And so we're going to talk today about really what that means, actually getting that nutrient out on the field and doing the best job we can with it. So first off, just a tiny bit of a recap. This is our soil sample. It may look similar to this, depending on the lab, may look very different depending how it's set up. But the important thing is there that we are measuring the nutrients that are available within our soils, and we're using that information to create our fertility plan. So the purpose of that soil test, once again, we're looking at that nutrient capacity of the soil, what's in there, and secondly, what is that intended crop that we're trying to plant, and what nutrients does that crop need to grow? And combining those two really creates our fertility plan. And that fertility plan, it's all focused on maximizing that profitability for that crop. And it may be something that you're maximizing that profitability in a single year, or it might be a long-term approach. But it's really looking at, feeding that crop what it needs to be fed and making sure we're not over applying or under applying to really give that crop its best chance to maximize that profitability. So touching back on a few different ways to look and go through that soil test, there's the three main different philosophies for how we can look at that soil test and how we look at those plant nutrients that we need. So the first being the sufficiency approach. So really look at what exactly does that crop need in a given year. And it's really about that crop response to added nutrients. So for something like phosphorus and potassium, in a lot of cases, it makes sense that, we're applying just what we need to get that crop over the finish line and not applying any more than that, because we may be looking at a short-term arrangement, or we're looking to just pay for that yield increase with the nutrient. But these are what we have published as our OMAFA guidelines. And as an example here, just to compare our different philosophies, with the soil test that we had up earlier, we may be looking at 63 pounds of actual phosphate and 98 pounds of actual potassium per acre. If we compare that to crop removal, so this is just simply replacing the nutrients that come out at harvest. So with a bushel of corn or a bushel of soybeans, there's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients, secondary nutrients all included there. So we're kind of looking, especially with P and K, to really just replace what that crop is removing from the soil. And finally, our build and maintain approach. And this is really looking at building up those low testing levels, maintaining at moderate levels, and where we've got very high or extreme soil test levels where we know we're going to get zero response to added fertilizer. We know there's a higher environmental risk at those high levels. We can draw those down, take advantage of the fertility that's in the soil, and really make sure that we're just fertilizing what we need, building up so we've got a good potential for that yield, and looking to maintain those levels. And so comparing the three different approaches here, there's some similarities, there's some differences between them, but really it's all about finding what philosophy works for your field. And if we look at nitrogen, sulfur, our secondary and micronutrients, nitrogen especially is one that the sufficiency approach is always what we're using. And so nitrogen, we know that because we're in a climate with lots of water, lots of potential for loss, we can apply nitrogen for multiple years and have it stick around. So we're really trying to look at what's the most efficient rate that we can apply to that field. And we've got tools to do it, from Agris or the corn nitrogen calculator that's shown here. We've got pre-side dress nitrate testing. There's many different tools that can enable us to make a better decision on our nitrogen rates. And if we look at our secondary nutrients, so sulfur, magnesium, calcium, as well as our micronutrients, they're really on an individual field basis. We want to look at, what those levels are according to the soil test. Are we likely to see a response? Does it make sense to build those? So with something like magnesium, if you're in a low testing soil, absolutely it may make sense to build that. With something like sulfur, where we know we're again kind of like nitrogen in a loss-prone environment, it doesn't make as much sense to try and build that up. But look at what fits on your individual farm is the right approach. And so moving on to today's topic, we've gone through our soil test, we've made our recommendation, our fertilizer recommendation. Now what? And so it's really about trying to fit that whole recommendation tied in with what actually works in your individual operation. And because there's so many different ways to go around how you plant the crop, how you fertilize that crop, your kinds of tillage, whether or not you've got manure or organic amendments, there's so many different ways that it's going to differ on every individual farm, and in a lot of cases, the individual field itself. So a lot of things like soil type, slope, CEC, organic matter. They're things that are either unchangeable or very hard to change. And so it's more about adapting what we're doing to that specific area. And so if we look at all of these different things that go on in the field, that's really where we look at the 4R nutrient stewardship approach. And a lot of cases, this is things that you're already doing on your farm, but it's giving a bit more focus on how the different ways of really fertilizing that crop, how they interact with each other, and how they may affect certain ways that we are doing things. And so if you're not familiar with the 4Rs, they are all about using that fertilizer, that plant nutrient with the right source, at the right rate, in the right time, and in the right place. And so over the past couple webinars here, we've really done a focus on the right rate. And a lot of what we deal with when it comes to soil test translation is looking at that rate. And so, we're looking at a low testing soil. We're going to apply a higher rate of fertilizer. A higher testing soil, we may be applying a lower rate of fertilizer. But it's really about that rate determination that's a big part of that soil test interpretation. However, there's a lot of fine tuning that right rate that goes on after we kind of get that initial fertility recommendation that comes from that soil test. And so the right rate in any case is the rate that's going to match the goals for that field. So whether we're trying to build those soil test levels, whether we're trying to just apply whatever is according to the economics in that individual year, that rate is going to match that. But it's also going to match the rate that's best done with our own equipment or a partner's equipment, our own operation. If we're dealing with an operation that we've got an off-farm job and maybe don't have the time to really spoon feed it with many operations throughout the year, what can we do to better increase that efficiency of the fertilizer? And can we reduce that rate that we're applying while still maintaining or increasing the yield? And that's really the ultimate goal is, apply less inputs to get a better output. And one of the questions that I've been getting a lot lately, and I'm sure a lot of agronomists are getting the same thing, due to input prices that are staying or increasing, and crop prices that maybe aren't following quite the same, is where can I cut back due to those high prices? And so really without having that soil test, that translation to begin with, it's incredibly difficult to really say where we can afford to cut back. And so that's where rate is really dependent on the interaction with the other 4Rs. So what Dale and I are going to go through here today is looking at, not just the right rate, but how the right source and the right time and the right place really interact with that, and how to utilize those different methods of improving efficiency of our fertility plan. So to start off here, I'm going to look at right source. And so if we think about crop nutrients, there's a lot of different ways that we can get those crop nutrients out in the field to the plants. So things like manure or organic amendments are a wonderful source of nutrients that, depending whether you've got livestock or where you're located, you may have more or less access to those nutrients. But there's also a lot of commercial fertilizers that we can use to either fill in the gaps from manure or look at our fertility plan on total. And so the most important part is that when we're thinking about the right source, we look at what that soil test actually says we need. And so it's pretty obvious if we're in dire need of phosphorus, we're not going to be applying more nitrogen to try and fill that gap. It's all about looking at that lowest stave in the barrel, finding our limiting factor and addressing that. One of the other factors that comes down to looking at the source is things like crop safety. And I know Dale is going to touch a little bit on this in a minute here, but things like ammonia and salt can really affect what sources of fertilizer we use and when we use it and the rate that we can use. But also things like chloride. We've got certain crops like tobacco that are sensitive to certain nutrients that are included in some fertilizers. So knowing exactly what source you're using is critically important to making sure we can maintain the yield and quality of those crops. We also look at nutrient availability. So how available to the plant are these nutrients right off the bat? How can they fit with the equipment we've got? Do we need to invest in a new piece of equipment? Do we need to rent something, hire a partner to be able to apply that to the field? But then we've also got things like loss prevention. So how can we apply that nutrient to the field? What source can we use to maybe minimize some of those losses? And then, of course, there's cost, which a lot of times it comes down to looking at the different options that may fit and taking a look at how exactly we can work those in economically to our specific situation. So just to focus up here on one aspect that I mentioned here, we're going to look at nitrogen stabilizers. So these are a product that we can add to several different forms of nitrogen fertilizer, the most common being urea or UAN fertilizers, and really looking at breaking down how they work, where they may be applicable to an operation, and why we may want to use them. So first off, I've got a very, very, very simplified version of the nitrogen cycle here. Specifically, the part that's looking at what happens to that urea fertilizer when we place it on the ground. And it's important to note that urea fertilizer by itself is actually a stable form of nitrogen. It's not until it hits that soil and gets some moisture that the enzymes within that soil can actually get to work and move it around and change that form of nitrogen to become a losable form. So once it hits the soil from a broadcast or injected application, it goes through hydrolysis, which urease enzyme will change it into ammonium. And that ammonium by itself is a plant available nutrient, so plants can take it up. But there's more going on within that soil that we've also got another transformation that happens called nitrification. And in this transformation, the microbes within the soil will take that ammonium and turn it into nitrate. And again, that's a plant available form. So both of those forms readily available to that plant for nutrition, which is a good thing. However, we've also got some potential for loss with each of those forms. So if we've got a large amount of that nitrogen sitting as ammonium, if it's on the soil surface or in a high pH zone or in a real windy, dry situation, that's where we can lose a lot of that to volatilization. And that is essentially ammonia gas that's leaving the soil surface. And we can lose a relatively large amount of nitrogen to that volatilization if the conditions are right. When it comes to nitrate, we can also lose that nitrate fertilizer through a transformation called denitrification, where it will change from microbes within the soil, will change that form from nitrate to nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is a major greenhouse gas emission. But really what we're looking at is we can lose that nitrate and have it completely unavailable for the plant. We can also lose that nitrate through a process called leaching, which is essentially moving with the water out of that soil profile down below the rooting zone, and in some cases out the tile drains to our rivers and lakes. The point is that there's a lot of different ways that nitrogen can be lost, and unfortunately, that's one of the biggest challenges with nitrogen is applying the right rate to maximize the efficiency while minimizing the losses. And that's where the interaction of source, timing, and place comes into effect. So if we talk about nitrogen stabilizers, what they do is dependent on the type of nitrogen stabilizer that we've got. So the first type is called a urease inhibitor. So I've got a couple examples here of some popular products. By no means are they meant as an advertisement. There are others there that work with different ingredients, different brand names, etc. But these are just some commonly used examples. And so a urease inhibitor, what it does is it essentially blocks or slows down that hydrolysis. So it keeps that nitrogen in the urea form for longer. It'll slowly convert to ammonium, which is plant available, and that plant will be able to take up that ammonium as it's slowly converted. So essentially slows down that hydrolysis reaction. On the other side, nitrification inhibitors will slow down that nitrification reaction. And so this keeps that fertilizer in the ammonium form longer, which is plant available, and slows down that reaction to nitrate. And so what that means is there's more ammonium, which depending where our fertilizer is placed, if we've got that placed under the soil surface where there's less risk of volatilization, that's exactly what we want. If we know we've got a high risk of leaching or denitrification, then we want less of that nitrate in the soil where it's got potential to be lost, and maybe more of that ammonium. So simply slowing down the processes. And if we look at dual inhibitors, that's where they slow down both of those hydrolysis and nitrification reactions. And so that keeps basically a slower transition of that urea fertilizer into the ammonium forms and into the nitrate forms, which means there's less available for loss at any one time. So now that we've got a bit of the science behind us, what does that really mean? So less loss of volatilization, less denitrification, less leaching means there's more nitrogen available of that fertilizer for that plant. And so we've got some very outstanding research that's been done in Ontario. One study that I'm going to look at here today is from Dr. Craig Drury at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And what questions they had as part of this project was looking at, do the different types of nitrogen stabilizers, urease and nitrification inhibitors, do they actually reduce N loss? And if so, what is the effect on corn yield? And so what they found out from a multi-year study in Harrow, Woodsley in Essex County, is they had two different scenarios, one where they broadcasted urea on the soil surface, and one where they injected liquid UAN fertilizer in the row. And they had both an untreated, so just the fertilizer by itself, and also a treated with urease inhibitor and a nitrification inhibitor, so a dual inhibitor essentially. And what they found was that they decreased ammonia losses quite drastically. By 75% from the urea and by 90% from the UAN. And at the same time, they increased yield. And so in this case, by 8 and 13 bushels per acre. The important part is that the yield response is only going to occur when nitrogen losses can be reduced. So if we don't have that moment where those nitrogen losses are actually going to be present, that yield response doesn't really occur. It's only if we're going to lose those nitrogen do we really see a major benefit to those inhibitors? And so that's something where we may be looking at it more of an insurance standpoint, and especially when nitrogen is priced more on the higher side, it becomes a bit more attractive from the economics to use that as insurance as opposed to increasing the rate. And so, how does that affect the nitrogen rate that we've got? So I've got two scenarios here, looking at the maximum economic rate of nitrogen, or MERN, with and without inhibitors. And so the green line here is the corn yield just with a nitrogen fertilizer by itself. And along the axis at the bottom, we're looking at an increasing rate of nitrogen and how that affects yield on the side on the y-axis. And so we can see that that green line shows as we increase our nitrogen rate, we eventually hit a plateau. And in this case, it's somewhere around 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, gives us our maximum yield. And if we apply more than that, we don't really see any subsequent increase in that yield. And then in our blue bar here, we've got to look at that corn yield with nitrogen inhibitor. And so we can see that it still plateaus at that same level once we get to a relatively high rate of nitrogen, and it's still at zero nitrogen. Doesn't affect the yield, obviously, because we're not applying nitrogen, but it's that middle ground that we can see that there's an increase in that yield. And really, if we look at the maximum economic rate of nitrogen, we can see that when we're using that inhibitor, assuming there's potential for loss, we can actually decrease our maximum economic rate of nitrogen. And so when we're looking at these curves, it's, looking at them, it makes sense that we're kind of raising those curves up. So we're increasing our yield. But in actuality, what those nitrogen inhibitors are doing is they're actually moving that curve over to the left. So at that given rate of nitrogen, we can decrease it and maintain the same yield. So we're not having those losses. And so in this case, we've taken a maximum economic rate of nitrogen of around 160 pounds and actually reduced that by about 40 pounds to 120. And so that's really showing that, we're not necessarily gaining yield. We're able to maintain that yield by using a lower nitrogen rate. And really that's where we've got to look at it. That's the money that goes back into your pocket in terms of rate of return from that stabilizer. So the other aspect that is critically important, and when we're talking about nutrient sources, is knowing exactly what's in them. And I've got an example here that shows a screen from Agris, which, as we explained last time, is our free software and especially useful for calculating nutrient needs and manure nutrient availability. But it's important that no matter what we're using, whether it's a commercial fertilizer, whether it's a manure, or whether it's organic amendment, we know exactly what's in that, and we can credit exactly what nutrients we're getting out of those different sources. Especially when it gets to high-priced fertility, we can really see the benefits of those different organic amendments and different fertilizers that we use, and really make sure that whatever source we're using, we're giving it the credit that it needs. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Dale now. And Dale's going to talk on the timing and placement aspects.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Hey, great job on that. Nice introduction to the beginning of fertilizer placement. So I'm going to carry on with the theme of the 4R stewardship and the carrying on with, if I can get it to move here. Here we go. So I want to just delve a little bit into this whole 4Rs nutrient stewardship. We talk a lot about it, but there is actually a dealer certification program that was developed. A memorandum of understanding was signed amongst the Ontario Agribusiness Association, which represents the stakeholder interest in the crop input suppliers, and of course GFO, Ontario Federation of Agriculture, Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario, Fertilizer Canada, and OMAFA, of course, all signed on, and a lot of the development went on. Anyways, this gave rise to Stewardship Ontario with two committees, one a steering committee to oversee the activities of this organization, and a technical standards committee, of which I sit on, that developed the 4R stewardship program for dealers. It is a voluntary program. And we came up with a whole set of standards in four key areas, but it all starts with a current soil test, nothing older than 4 years upon which to base your recommendations. So when the dealers are audited, we have to demonstrate that for our customers, we have current soil test. And if we don't pass the audit. So we have training, application, recommendations, and documentation are four key areas that we're audited in every 2 years. And I'll just give you a quick sample of some of the audits. Under applications, there's about 10 main audit points. So it says stuff like crop nutrient recommendations neither made or recommended to be made on frozen or snow-covered ground. So we have to provide documentation that we don't make those recommendations. Where field variability and in-crop nutrient need or environmental risk is identified and vertebrate application is warranted, a site-specific nutrient application is used or at least recommended. And phosphorus injection, subsurface banding, or broadcast with immediate incorporation are the recommended placement methods unless the risk of phosphorus loss to surface water has been demonstrated to be low according to a provincially approved index risk assessment tool. And one of those can be found in the Agri suite that Colin mentioned, that's called Plato. And it gives you a nice, you step through that process and it gives you a risk assessment for what you're doing based on your soil textures, slope position, and application rates and product. So one final point, just an example, a broadcast application of crop nutrients without immediate incorporation, neither made nor recommended unless a documented weather forecast indicating less than a 50% chance of an inch or more of rain in the next 12 hours. In other words, don't be putting on your fertilizer and waiting for the rain to wash it in. That really doesn't happen. It's a high risk activity for leaving the field. So as I said, we're audited every 2 years, and we simply have to provide evidence to the auditor on these key points, demonstrating with some of our recommendations to our customers that we are aligned with the standards. So once we're 4R certified again, and any customer we work with, their farms are now considered 4R certified acres as well. So as we said, 4Rs cover the source, rate, time, and place of nutrient use. So I'm going to focus more on the placement and timing of applied nutrients. So there's lots of factors involved in this. Colin touched on some of them, but what are the crop requirements? I'm going to kind of focus on some of the fall activity for PK, possibly sulfur, magnesium, lime, and a little bit of micronutrients. What are the total needs for broadcast versus banded? How do I split up my application rates that are most effective for the crop? When do I use a pop-up fertilizer? When do I use strip till? What about nutrient mobility? What leaches and what stays? Understanding how the nutrients behave in the soil. Phosphorus, once in the soil, might only move 3 millimeters a year. Potash might move 5 or 6. So both are relatively immobile, but that does play into the strategy for placement. And of course, nutrient stratification. Surface application not incorporated can put a concentrated layer in the top 2 inches of the soil, which may or may not strand nutrients up there. Also, especially phosphorus, can be prone to some off-site movement with heavy rainfall. So sources and rates have been covered in the series already. So let's start with phosphorus. It's mainly MAP that we're using, ammonium phosphate, although we did have some triple phosphate introduced this fall. Relatively non-mobile once it's in the soil. When you look at crop needs, it's needed early in the season. So when we start to look at what the phosphorus needs are and what the crop needs are, it starts to make sense. I want to put this as close to developing roots as possible. So this is where the starter fertilizer philosophy comes in, is placing it near that developing root system early in the season, especially when we have cold backward weather. We want a really soluble source of phosphorus for that early season uptake that helps with root structure, root development, and kernel set early in the corn's life cycle. So it has a lot of reasons that we want it there. And the harvest index for phosphorus is quite high. About 79% of the phosphorus that's taken up ends up in the grain. So getting as much as we can into the plant to be translocated to the grain later is kind of an important step in optimizing yields. Also a factor when we're growing wheat and soybeans. So often we band phosphorus in a starter, often a 2x2 band. So 2x2 means it's 2 inches to the side and 2 inches below seeding depth. So if you're planting 4 inches or 2 inches deep, that means your band has to be 4 inches deep. I'm not always convinced we get it down 4 inches deep with some of the things I've seen in the field. And that comes back to haunt us a little bit with we talk about salts. So oftentimes a starter is also a good place to position sulfur in the spring. Sometimes a little bit of potassium helps. Certainly a great place to put micronutrients like zinc and maybe some boron. So there's lots of positioning of nutrients that are needed early in the season. So this is one of the benefits to starter. If you are side dressing most of your nitrogen later, then it's always a good idea to put up to at least 30 pounds of nitrogen in the starter. It's beneficial for boosting yield early in the season, getting good biomass production. Sometimes you can't make up for this loss of yield potential by putting more nitrogen on later. So the later you put your nitrogen on, the more critical it is to have a little extra nitrogen in the corn starter. Liquid starters, very analysis out there. Some you can apply directly to the seed. Others need to be applied in a 2x2 band. So seed applied, sometimes referred to as pop-up fertilizer. They do a great job at supplying the first 14 pounds of P2O5. So some of the products we know, like 624-6. There's some 1034 liquid out there, not really suitable for put on the seed unless you use extremely low rates. So often that is put on in a 2x2 band. And one of the thumb rules, and we'll get into this later, if you're putting fertilizer on the seed directly, the amount of N plus K plus S has to stay under 10 kilograms per hectare or 9 pounds per acre to avoid any salt burn or damage to the developing seedling in the seed trench. So there's where your first limitation on rates are coming from, and that position on the seed becomes very critical. It's a great tool. Also, you can overdo it with too high a rate. So if you've just harvested 280 bushels of corn, you likely removed around just over 100 pounds of P2O5. So this is a shortfall of 92 pounds of P if all you've used is a pop-up fertilizer. So this is going to start to draw down the soil test that Colin's talked about. And so how critical is that drawdown? Well, it depends where your soil test levels are to begin with. If you're really high, you got a little bit of time before you worry about your soil test level getting so low that you're starting to interfere with crop growth. So if we look at 35 pounds of P2O5 from the OMAFRA recommendations to drop a soil test or raise a soil test 1 part per million, so 92 pounds would suggest that soil tests after 1 year would drop just over 2.5 parts per million. So if, for example, if you're already at 40 ppm phosphorus and you're waiting to get down to 20 to make a fertilizer application, how long would that take in this scenario? Well, you'd have 8 years before you really start worrying too terribly much about being short on phosphorus. So it's not a 1-to-1. It's not 92 pounds to the ppm. There's a factor there of 35 pounds. So keep that in mind. It takes a long time to draw down. It takes an even longer time, it seems, to raise things back up. So this kind of speaks to having an annual amount of fertilizer rather than waiting till you need large amounts at the last minute. So phosphate needs to be managed to reduce the potential loss past the edge of the field. So the post-harvest and before planting is when runoff is likely to occur. So our post-harvest season, after harvest and before planting, is when we lose our phosphorus into surface water. So how we manage the timing of the application, the placement in the fall, if we are doing a fall, and our residue management and our tillage greatly impacts on the potential for runoff. So how we manage our soils and our placement becomes very critical. So the factors you want to consider, A, what's your soil test, as we already covered, what's your rate of application, and what's the application manner that you're going to put on. All that stuff matters. So nutrient incorporation goes a long way to help reduce some of that stratification. There's a component of phosphorus called dissolved reactive phosphorus, that very small component of the phosphorus. And if you stratify and keep it on the surface, that becomes problematic because that little bit of phosphorus is free to move in runoff water. So we want to be aware of that. but the losses are small. It is neither an agronomic or economic of any significance. We're talking less than a pound of phosphorus, so there's just no agronomic significance to the amount that's lost. However, it is extremely damaging to surface water, right? So little as 0.03 ppm of phosphorus in the water can support an algal bloom. So it doesn't take much to have surface water problems. So while we may not worry too terribly much about losing up to a pound of phosphorus off a field, it has huge environmental implications. So that's why we need to manage it. So this graph here is just showing the relationship between the normal soil test on the bottom and the dissolved reactive P associated with it. So the good news here is if you manage your soil test levels and manage your application rates and limit your phosphorus buildup, you also to control the amount of dissolved reactive P and therefore the risk for runoff in the surface water. It'll never be zero. The goal is to keep it as minimal as possible. So as you increase your soil test, there's really no reason to have your phosphorus soil test above 50 parts per million for most of the broadacre row crops that we grow. So if you're in that 20 to 25 ppm range, you're going to have some relatively low dissolved reactive P, and therefore your risk starts to go down on any runoff leaving the edge of your field. Whoops! And so one of the solutions, of course, is this placement technology. So this is strip till has become popular now. You're not going to afford a strip tiller with the amount of phosphorus dissolved reactive P, but it has lots of other labor savings and other minimal soil disturbance that goes a long way in improving soil health and nutrient management. So banding P and K in the fall, only disturbing 10% of or a third of the soil surface, leaving that residue there. There's lots of benefits to having a better residue management system and positioning fertilizer below ground. An example of phosphorus stratification. This is from a no-till clay loam where it's no-till and the fertilizer was broadcast in the fall and not incorporated. It's a number of years ago. So you see that top 2 inches at 42 parts per million, the next 2 inches down at 17, the final 4 to 6 at 10, and then a normal 6-inch sample is 25 ppm. Does any of this matter for yield? And we can't really say definitively that it does, except maybe in a dry year you might have some stranded nutrients. But if you shallow up your soil sampling for whatever reason, then you're going to inflate your soil sample values and underestimate the fertilizer you might need. And of course, as I talk about the dissolved reactive phosphorus, it's going to be concentrated in that top 2 inches and be in a position to possibly move with excessive runoff water. So doing some tillage, doing some band placement, or a variety of placements will help reduce some of that stratification. So that is one of the factors, I think, in reducing runoff of P is reduce your stratification. A little bit about potassium. Early season uptake on corn is rather small. Most of the K is taken up during the rapid vegetative growth stages. The harvest index on potassium is only 0.33, which means there's very little goes off in the grain. It mostly stays in the stalk and the leaves and gets returned to the soil. We often include a little bit of K in our starter fertilizer in the spring, but most is broadcast either in the spring or the fall. And we want it incorporated down where the roots are going to find it. This is taken up later in the season during the big vegetative growth period in corn, for example. So getting it down where the roots and moisture are is going to optimize your potassium uptake. So that's where we want to be. And as we talk about starters, again, we talk about these safe rates of starter. We can't get too carried away in a 2x2 band by putting all of our potash on at that point. We can put some there, maybe 10 or 20 pounds, but we have to watch that N plus K and S relationship. And it's more of an issue on sandy soils with low buffering capacity. And when they're dry is when you run into the biggest constraints on application rates. So these are the uptake graphs for corn. So the upper left is dry matter. You see about 50% of the dry matter ends up in the grain. So the harvest index on corn, we says 50%. So if you have a 200 bushel corn crop, you got 11,200 pounds of grain. You also got 11,200 pounds of stover. So that's how that index works. That's partitioning of your dry matter. The one on the lower left is the phosphorus uptake. You see it starts out small in the early growth stages, but it's pretty linear all the way through to maturity. So there's a season-long aspect of phosphorus uptake. So good soil structure, good root massing, good soil test levels, a starter placement, and maintaining your soil test levels is going to feed that phosphorus all season long. The upper right-hand side is nitrogen. You'll see nitrogen pretty much mirrors the potassium below. You've got a small uptake at the beginning, and then this huge uptake during the rapid vegetative growth phase, same on potassium. And you'll notice that there's a good chunk of the nitrogen in that blue partitions to the grain to make the protein. And you notice in the potassium, very little potassium, it's that 33% is all it gets in the grain. So the rest stays in the stalk, returned to the soil. So it just gives you the idea of understanding what's needed, where it's needed, and how it partitions. And then that plays into just how we manage nutrient applications. So we're talking about this. This is right out of the OMAFRA publication. So this is giving you some guidelines on the total salt. So if you look at the second top line there, banded 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters or 2 by 2 inches below the seed. You look at corn, you see urea. The maximum rate of urea is 40 kilograms per hectare in 30-inch rows in a 2 by 2 band. If you move over and you're going to put on N and K and S, then the maximum amount of, if you're using urea, the maximum amount of NP or NK and S is 79. If you use any other fertilizer other than urea, like ammonium sulfate, then you can go to 117 or roughly 105 pounds of total N, K, and S. The phosphorus is not a salty material. These are the three things they have to watch for. So that's going to limit how much you can put in a band. And when you go further down with seed, you see with corn, you're looking at that 10 kilograms per hectare of N plus K plus S, so about 9 pounds an acre. So if you look at a 624-6, that's where the 5 gallon an acre comes from. You're pretty much right around that 7 to 8 pounds of N plus K. So that's going to limit your on-seed application. So that chart is useful in helping you formulate just how much I can get away with. At the very bottom line is the broadcast and or strip till. I know that Ben Rosser is working on a strip till project. I think he's finishing his second year up, so we'll wait to see what those results are. But about 250 kilograms per hectare is the maximum amount of N plus K plus S you want to put in a strip till. That's a guideline. When you're in sandy soil and dry, that's probably a pretty good guideline. The heavier your soil texture, the more moisture you have, the more material you can put down because the salt effect is much less. The clay has a higher buffering capacity to absorb salts and it holds more water. So you can get away with a little more on clay soil with adequate moisture. So that just gives you some guidelines on fertilizer placement from a salt standpoint. So variable rates, site-specific applications. I'm just going to quickly go through a field here that's the yield map on the left-hand side. That area I've highlighted in the green is about 70, almost 73 bushels of soybeans. The corresponding phosphorus in that area is only 17. So then the decision is, what am I going to do? The field average is 35 ppm. So on average, I'm not too worried about my phosphorus soil test on this field as a whole. But I got an area down here that is showing me I've got significant acres I should pay attention to. Then the question is, do I just cover crop removal? I got my yield already. I know what the crop removal value is. So that's about 125 pounds a map in that area. And then do I want to build my phosphorus soil test up to 20 parts per million? Well, that adds another 50 pounds a map. So then my application potentially could become 175, or I just stick with crop removal and drive on from there. So that's phosphorus in that area. That's more of the heavier soil texture. This one, these red areas, this is sharp sandy knoll, 80% sand. And by the way, this field was done with Soil Optics. It's a soil scanning program done on this field. So the phosphorus, so the soil yield in this area is only 57. The phosphorus soil test is over 53. So I'm not really too terribly worried about any phosphorus in this field. I know what the crop removal is going to be, but I can probably just forget about phosphorus in this area in the field. I don't need to build it any higher. I doubt that it's limiting yield at that level. And my first yield limiting factor is moisture. So I'm not too terribly worried in that part of the field about phosphorus. Shifting gears to potassium, same sort of thing, same yield. My potassium here is 193, pretty good number. Do I want to maintain that with crop removal? So that's about 160 pounds of potash. Or do I push in the clutch and just skip a year because 198 is not hurting me? So this is how you start to look at the spatial distribution of nutrients relative to yield in your field. And then I focus on that sandy area. The soil test there is only 100 ppm. The cation exchange capacity 7.6, so I know it's pretty light. Maybe potash is affecting me when I have lots of moisture. So if I want to do a buildup, I spread it over 4 or 5 years. So that's an extra 74 pounds plus my crop removal. So I have an option here to look at, I'm putting on 283 pounds of potash in that area, or just look at crop removal. But I wanted to do something there. I think 100 ppm is probably a little too low for soybeans, corn, and wheat in the rotation. So these are the decision points you go through. This is land that you own. This is going to be strip tilled in the fall. They use a pop-up fertilizer in the spring, in addition to the P&K and the band. That's been worth about 11 bushel response each year with field trial work. So you start to see how you start to put together some of the spatial distribution going forward. And then putting it all together, putting it in the system, letting the logarithm run, then you see that, on average, the flat rate for phosphorus would be 4 ton. We're just under 2.5 ton variable rate, and potash would be a flat rate of 6 ton. We're just over or just under 4 ton of potash on that field. And you can see in the phosphorus in that gray area, there's areas not getting any phosphorus fertilizer at all. That kind of correspond to what I talked about there. And we could even question in the potash one on the right-hand side, that whole red area could probably be a zero application as well, because we're at 198. But I've been doing this for 47 years. I've never had a farmer thank me for lowering his soil test once. So we'll carry it on from there. So this puts together the yield map, the soil sample maps, a build maintain program, and this practices the very essence of 4R stewardship: source, rate, time, and place. Just to add a few more layers to it. So if you look at the yield in the top left there, that green area, is the highest yielding area in the field. On the right, top right, is a plant available water map from Soil Optics. So the highest amount of plant available water is down where the yield is the highest. I look over at soil organic matter. It's the highest soil organic matter, approaching 4%. And I look at cation exchange capacity. The clay content also is pretty high in that area too. So I got 4 pieces of information supporting why the field is yielding the way it is, why the nutrient profiles are the way they are, looking at the difference in soil texture. So I got a different view of nutrient management on this field with more information. Sulfur, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on sulfur. It's something that we've been working on as an industry. We know that canola, wheat, and alfalfa are pretty consistent in their response to sulfur. Corn sometimes, soybeans on occasion, but it is the sandy, low cation exchange capacity, low organic matter soils is where we're consistently seeing the sulfur response, even on soybeans. So it's not a panacea, it's not widespread, but we do get less and less sulfur out of rainfall every year. People are telling me we're down to 6 to 8 pounds of sulfur annually out of rainfall. Most crops require 25 to 30. So I would imagine it's just a matter of time before more crops show a response to sulfur, but this is where we are. It's a negative charge anion, so it doesn't stay in the soil solution. So it is sulfate sulfur, this one we want, that's plant available in the spring. Tends to be a spring application because we've always believed that sulfate leaches over winter. Well, there've been some new work out of Purdue that suggests that maybe not always be the case. So we've got some work ahead of us. It's a great opportunity to do some on-farm trials to answer the question, do we need to put sulfur on every year if I have a history of using sulfur on my crop rotation? So an unknown question, something worth digging into. Limestone applications, pH, we got to get that right. Nothing else matters if the pH isn't right. So on the left-hand side, you see those bar graphs run horizontally. Wherever they're the widest is the area of maximum nutrient availability or solubility. So if you drop a line at 6.8 straight down that bottom of that chart, it intersects those bars at the widest point. So 6.8 is the perfect pH. As pH goes up, nutrient availability declines, and some of the nutrients as pH goes down also declines. So not going to get too heavily involved in this, other than pH management is pretty critical. If you're worried about micronutrients, one of your first clues would be look at your pH in your soil report. If it's over 7, you may want to start paying attention to some of the micronutrients because you see their availability starts to decline as pH goes up. Lime applications are, basically they're best done in the fall. It takes time for limestone to react. There's a number of factors we need to consider. Ag index is one of the most important things, is how that's an indication of the quality of the limestone. We make our recommendations assuming an ag index of 75. And so that's what's going to drive our adjustment in lime. So if you have a lime that only has an index of 50, then you have to put on more lime to have the same neutralizing value of an ag index 75. And what's your choice? You look at your soil report. Where's my magnesium levels? Where's my calcium level? That chooses whether you use dolomitic or calcitic. And these are the contents in the lime. So lots of things to consider. Lime's not lime. You need to know the egg index. You need to know how much you need. The buffer pH is what's driving your limestone needs. So that's what determines the amount of lime you need, is your buffer pH on your soil report. And so there's lots of things to consider. Working with a trusted advisor at your retail location or a consultant is going to help you a step through getting the right lime on the right rate, and generally needs to be incorporated throughout the whole root zone. I know that's not always popular when you have reduced till or no till, but putting lime on top is not changing the bulk pH of the soil. Sorry about that. Just got an alert. So micronutrients becoming more critical as we do more research in biostimulants and biologicals. We know that these are cofactors in alleviating stress and reducing reactive oxygen species reactions that cause crop damage. So there's been a whole renewed interest in micronutrients. They are essential nutrients. Zinc and boron are the main ones to be soil applied. Boron can also be applied foliar later in the season, about 0.25 actual B per acre. Manganese is the wild card. It's best applied foliar because it reacts so much in the soil to form unavailable forms. It can be soil applied, but you want to put it with something like MAP that gives an acidifying band to keep it available longer. Soil pH, organic matter influence micronutrient availability in general terms. But for manganese, it's the oxidation reduction reaction. So when the soils are dry, they oxidize manganese to unavailable forms. When it rains, it gets reduced to more plant available forms. So that's why you'll see your manganese deficiency become less after a rain. It reduces it from an unavailable to available form. So it's a little more tricky to manage, but usually foliar, and sometimes you have to do more than one foliar application because it's non-mobile in the plant. So you need to keep treating the new growth, especially on soybeans, to alleviate the deficiency. So those are some of the things to be considered when you're dealing with micronutrients. So how much time do I have left?
Got a couple of minutes, Dale.
All right, I'm gonna finish up here. So I've been interested in this big corn yield in our area. I fully admit not everyone's had a stellar corn season, but down our area we're getting an extra 50, 60 bushels of corn more than expected. So I decided to do a nutrient content on the corn. So this is very busy. So let's focus on the bold at the back, at the very bottom. This is the average content per bushel. So the average yield on these 10 plots, I think they're 10, is 249.9 bushels per acre, a high of 291, a low of 188. Nitrogen content per bushel on average about 0.78, 0.293 NP2O5, which is I consider to be low. Potassium 0.22, which I also consider to be low. Magnesium and sulfur. But when I convert it using the yield to the pounds of N and P2O5, that corn on crop removal contains about 197 pounds of nitrogen on average, about 72 pounds of phosphorus, about 56 pounds of K2O, about 10.5 pounds of magnesium, but 18.7 pounds of sulfur, which I found interesting. So that's the crop removal. So as interesting as that is, I use the harvest index, which are published in various research papers. So I take the crop removal and I divide it by the index for nitrogen, which is 0.58%, which means 58% of the nitrogen that's taken up is in the grain. So I just convert that over. So in that first example of 291 bushel the acre, based on the estimate of the harvest index, that corn had found 422 pounds of nitrogen to grow the entire plant on that field, right? Most of these plots had 190 N applied. So a lot of this nitrogen had to come from other sources, mainly mineralization. So on average, these plots took up 339 pounds of nitrogen. 87 pounds of P2O5, 170 pounds of K2O, 36 pounds of mag, and 33 pounds of sulfur. So that's the total up to, that's what the plants had to find to grow the grain, stalk, leaves, and roots. So considering that we had some pretty stellar yields, so I happen to know that 291 bushel field was fertilized for 220 bushel acre yield goal. That was the long-term goal. 185 pounds N was applied and ended up at 200, almost 300 bushel of corn. So when you quickly do the math, there had to be at least between uptake and removal, an extra 140 to maybe even 160 pounds of nitrogen had to come from somewhere from mineralization from the soil. And actually, it's higher than that because fertilizer itself is not 100% available. So there's a good amount of mineralization that occurred this year in some of these fields. So the question I'll leave you with is if you're going to grow 300 bushel of corn next year, how much nitrogen are you going to put on, considering we fertilized for 220 and ended up close to 300. So my summary slide, managing all essential nutrients is vital, optimizing crop production. Control the controllables. When you have lots of uncertainty, then focus on what you can control. Current soil tests are required every 4 years for 4R stewardship. Soil test results are both descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. So they'll describe what's going on in your field, they'll predict an outcome, and we can prescribe and amend soils in very precise ways. So soil samples have a lot of utility. Understanding how nutrients behave in the soil, match the peak crop demand, dictates what, when, how, and where we use them. And as I always say, obey your mom, minimize the size of your environmental footprint, optimize your harvested yield, maximize your nutrient use efficiency. So thank you for listening. I'm going to give up my control back to Colin.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Dale.
Yeah.
So
I'll
just,
sorry. Yep. You've got 5 minutes.
yeah. Yeah. Sorry. So I've just got a few slides here to kind of wrap up, give a bit of a summary over our whole 3-part webinar series here. But yeah, one of the most important things I wanted to touch on when it comes to application is that you've got to test it on your own farm. Everybody's got a different operation with different equipment, different management. So, a lot of things that we see response to something like sulfur, Dale mentioned, for example. We see it in certain situations, certain conditions, and what may work on my farm may not work on your own farm and vice versa. So it's important that when we are testing something, we look at more than a single strip in the field as well. We want to have some kind of replication so we can see whether it's just the natural variability that's in the soil that's causing a difference, or if there's actually something to that when it comes to response. So yeah, just to summarize our whole series here, soil sampling, one of the most important operations that you can do on your farm, and guaranteed to be money in your pocket at the end of the day. It's important to do it properly, use the proper equipment, make sure that's accurate, the right depth, a 6-inch sample for the vast majority of our nutrients, putting it at the right time in the rotation, really taking a look at how variable that field is and fitting the sampling to that. And of course, sending it to an accredited lab to make sure that the testing that's being done, that analysis actually means something. When we look at interpreting that soil test, looking at those results, we can look at it in a number of ways depending on the goals for that individual field, whether we're looking to maximize that short-term profitability or maximize that long-term profitability. There's different ways to do it. Most important part is that no matter what we're doing, we kind of keep an eye on that crop removal. And like Dale mentioned, when we're getting some, remarkable yields here in the deep Southwest, we're removing quite a bit more nutrient than we are when we've got an average crop or below average crop. So it's important to keep an eye on that. And depending on your goals, you will need to adjust your fertility program. We've got tools like Agri here that can really help simplify a lot of that soil test translation. Look at the nutrients that are available in organic amendments, and really hone in on what fertility we need. How does all our different aspects such as soil texture, heat units, yield, economics. How does that all play into it? And when it comes to applying that fertility plan, really make sure we're looking at those 4 R's, using the right source at the right rate, at the right time, in the right place, and really finding out ways to improve efficiency, reduce losses, and reduce costs on your individual farm. And I like to say a good fertility plan matches what's in the soil, that soil nutrient supply, with the individual goals for the field. And one final thought, every fertility plan is going to be different. So what your neighbor does is not going to be what you do, but you don't have to figure it out alone. So we've got lots of excellent agronomists here, certified crop advisors that I encourage you to work with. They may, if you're having any trouble looking at soil tests, figuring out a plan for them, we've got lots of fantastic resources here in the province. And make sure that you ask questions to really help you learn, either from us here, but also the partners that you're working with on farm. And so with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Laura now.
Amazing. Thank you to you both. That was an excellent. I can't even get over. It was a really good presentation. A lot of information that was shared that is incredibly usable. It was interesting. While you were both talking, I ended up pulling up my soil tests and my plan and was looking at it to say, okay, let's see where we can go from here, and to make sure we're considering 4 R's, of course, and making sure that everything falls into place how it should be. And yeah, so just really appreciate both of you sharing all of the knowledge that you have with us here today. I do have a couple of questions that have came in. Colin, in the meantime, if you could just go to the next slide, I would just encourage everybody to go back and watch their webinars again, should you need them, to follow through, pull out those soil samples, and kind of follow along. And of course, use your trusted assistance there to help. But those are the 3 webinars. They will be posted online on YouTube via the GFO YouTube channel. And if you go to the next slide, Colin, there's our CCA and off-CAF credits for those who are looking for them. So our first question here, and I would think this one's more geared towards Colin and his work with the AgriSuite calculator, but will N inhibitors be added to the corn nitrogen calculator or AgriSuite to help with adjusting N rates? So that's something that's on the to-do list.
It is definitely on the to-do list. The part of the issue now is that we don't have a real specific, credit for that individual inhibitor that we can really say, with any certainty that we can reduce nitrogen rates by this amount. That is something that is being researched now. So hopefully within a few years' time, we'll be able to add that in. I think that is an important aspect that we do need to look at and have included in that nitrogen calculation. But right now it's very dependent on that potential for loss as to what credit we can give to that nitrogen inhibitor. So. Just stay tuned, and hopefully within a few years we'll have that added in.
Another question has come in here, and there's a few parts to it. But if renting fields in general, who pays for the soil testing and the cost of fertilizers? And they're wondering, for hay fields, is it possible to apply lime without tilling? And are there any crops in Ontario that can be successfully grown without herbicides and pesticides? So for this webinar, we'll probably focus on the first 2 questions in particular here. And either one of you are welcome to dive in on that one.
Could you repeat the first one again?
Okay, so the first part is, if renting fields in general, who pays for soil testing and the cost of fertilizer? And then, is it possible to apply lime without working it in?
So cost of soil sampling and all that recommendation is usually borne by the customer. It's usually an investment, and there's a pretty good payback when you get recommendations that are tailored to your field, and you get the appropriate crop response. So, when soil tests come back high, you don't need too much. If they come back low, well then, you need to apply, but you're going to apply with confidence, anticipating a better crop. So, if I understood the question.
Yep, I think so.
And I think it does differ depending on the situation. a short-term rental agreement might make a difference compared to a long-term, whether, something like Lime, especially where it's maybe a more than 1 year till you really see the full benefit. Yeah, it can vary. I've seen different ways of splitting that cost up, but yeah, worth having a conversation with the landlord.
Well, addressing Lyme on forages, that is a bit of a challenge. So if we soil sampled before we seeded the forages, we have an opportunity to adjust that pH way ahead of time. If seeding the year before would be the ideal. So the next best thing is usually putting on lower rates of lime more often. It's going to take a long time. It's not very soluble, so it will start to adjust the surface pH and slowly move down. But it's a slow, painful process. So if you're growing alfalfa, you will probably see your alfalfa. If you have low pH, your alfalfa is not going to be very persistent.
But it's still worth doing if your pH is your limiting factor, then absolutely still worth doing, even if you're not tilling it in.
Yeah, yeah.
Understandable. So the next question that's come in here is, are there minimum or maximum rates that need to be considered for fertilizer application due to the equipment used? Like in the context of a rental applicator at a retail, and you may not know which applicator you may end up with. Is there a rate per acre that is a minimum rate?
Well,
go ahead, Dale.
Well, so rental applicators, they're just that, they're rental units. So if we're talking about side dress UAN, there are groups of customers that want to side dress 100 actual N, which is 33 gallons. So you set an applicator for that. Then there's others that want to put on 150. So you set a certain amount of your fleet applicators for that. And there's, depending on the pump, there's a rate range with orifice and stuff. So usually, you got a plus or minus 15 to 20 gallon range in most settings, but you're always adjusting the ratios on a pump or changing the orifice in a line. So at a retail, generally you've got applicators set up for various application rates, as much as we try to tailor it to unique needs. But it's we have a lot of farmers in our area that have their own, but even then, so I've been exposed to farmers that have their own. Even the rate range on something that's hydraulically driven is usually about a 30 gallon at the most. So if you can whiz along at 15 gallons the acre at 8 mile an hour. If you want to put on 80 gallons the acre, you're doing 2 mile an hour, right? So those are some of the limitations.
So I'm not seeing any other questions that are coming in. Overall, just thank you to everyone for joining us here today, and thank you to Dale and Colin for helping us out and sharing your knowledge again in this webinar. Is so very appreciated. So with that, just a reminder that this webinar will be posted along with the other two on gfo.ca if you're wanting to go back and revisit anything that was discussed. So anyways, thank you again to everyone, and we'll sign off for now.